In the 38th chapter of the book of Job, there is a portrayal of the Lord speaking to Job out of the whirlwind. And asking a number of questions. Gird up now thy loins like a man, and answer thou me. In other words, it is properly expected that there should be an understanding of those things portrayed through the questions which the Lord asked. Some of these questions I would like to read to you, presumably to call them to your remembrance. For they relate to an area of meditation which may well come to focus this evening. These are the 31st, 32nd, and 33rd verses. Canst thou bind the sweet influences of Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? Canst thou bring forth Mazzaroth in his season? Or canst thou guide Arcturus with his sons? Knowest thou the ordinances of heaven? Canst thou set the dominion thereof in the earth? Obviously, intellectually speaking, there is very little understanding of what is meant by these questions. The mind is inclined to write them off as meaningless, as it does anything that it doesn't understand. We are beginning to have a certain consciousness of relatedness with the universe. This was brought to a particular point in our time spent together in the banquet room of Red Coach Inn yesterday evening. We feel more particularly that we are a part of the solar system. There is a change, isn't there, in awareness in this regard, already experienced to some degree. Heretofore we were very much earthbound. Usually in relationship to a very small geographical part of the earth. For instance, 100 Mile House. Some have broad community consciousness. Some reach out a little further and have a national outlook, perhaps. BC to start with, I suppose. And then we're a part of the world, after all. But beyond that, it's only fairly recently that there has been a dawning awareness that we are really related to the rest of the solar system. Perhaps the excursion to the moon had something to do with this in the general pattern, but I'm thinking of it more from our standpoint. We have a consciousness of the relatedness of the solar system to the galaxy. Theoretically, we have been aware of the fact of this for quite some time, but there is more of a sensing of it now than there has been. These particular verses that I read reach out into the cosmos a little. And indicate once again that there is a pattern of relationship which directly affects the earth and those of us who live upon the surface of the earth. There has been, of course, something of a rather confused awareness in this regard, present in the consciousness of man over the ages, coming to focus in what is called nowadays astrology. This is the attempt of the self-active mind of man to understand what is beyond its comprehension. But at least there is some perception. Some people are very deep believers in astrology. There is some perception that there is a relationship between the various parts of the universe, and there are influences brought to bear in which we are involved in various ways. Some of the more obvious influences, of course, relate to the tides, the influence of the moon and the sun in this regard. If the oceans are capable of being moved to such extent by the influence of the moon, we will say, are we to suppose that the influence of the moon has no effect upon us? It would seem rather foolish to discount any possible influence. It really takes something, you know, to move the oceans. I think it would take far less to move us. So there is an effect. There are effects of various kinds. Of course, this particular one is physically observable. Many of them are not so easily discerned. The solar system is constantly moving in its particular orbit in the galaxy. And consequently the influences, whatever they are, which are brought to bear upon the solar system, and more particularly from our standpoint upon the Earth, are constantly changing. We note changes on Earth by observing the seasons. Of course, this is just movement in the solar system. But there are changes of a similar nature, in principle at least, which work out as the solar system moves through space in relationship to all the other heavenly bodies of our galaxy particularly. But then there are influences beyond that again, because there are other galaxies. So we find a whole network of influences here, of which the mind of man knows virtually nothing. Very few of these influences are taken into consideration at all. Some of them are observable in various ways. But in any case, this movement of the solar system and the Earth in particular, through a changing pattern of influence, has brought to bear upon this planet certain vibrational factors which relate to what has been experienced by the human race over the ages. If we consider the fact that man is created in the image and likeness of God, be the means by which the creative action of God could be operative on the surface of this planet, we are reminded that man was created in this fashion and functioned in this fashion on Earth for a considerable period of time, and then what is called the fall came. But why? This has been a problem to the mind of man, an insoluble problem. And yet, there are reasons as to why the fall occurred. Reasons which relate to the movement of the earth through these various vibratory influences which are brought to bear out of the cosmos. There was no necessity for man to fall, and there was no intention that he should. But there was the possibility that he might. In the creative cycles as they were established, this possibility was recognized, and man was warned in relationship to it. He was warned that in the outworking cycles a time would come when his mental comprehension of what was occurring would be obscured. In other words, his vision would be clouded because of the vibratory factors that were being brought to bear out of the cosmos. He was warned that this would take place, so that he might be alert to this happening. In order that when it did take place, and his vision, his mental vision was obscured, he wouldn't assume that he could see when he couldn't. All that was necessary was for him to remain properly centered without judging and without imagining that he had vision when he didn't. Now, there were some who were not very alert in this regard. And consequently, the vision being obscured, they forgot that they didn't need to leave things well enough alone, and proceeded to act on the basis of the obscured vision. And this produced the fall. I'm describing it this way because I wish to emphasize the point that the solar system, with our Earth, does pass through various patterns of vibrational influence extending out of the cosmos. And there was a period then, quite a while after man was inhabiting the earth as divine man, when the earth passed through this vibrational cloud, so to speak. It was anticipated that this would happen. There was nothing strange about it. But it opened the door for the possibility of what has been called the fall. And so every care was taken at that time to acquaint man with what was likely to happen, so that he would be alert and behave accordingly during the period that the earth was under these particular influences. It was only while this was the case that the fall was even a possibility. Now, of course, many thousands of years have elapsed since the earth entered this vibrational cloud. The fall did take place. But of course the solar system now has continued on in the circuit, so to speak, and is emerging out of that original vibrational influence which made it possible for the fall to take place. As there is an emergence out of this, the state, the fallen state, cannot continue to exist. And is in the process of passing away. Now, this aspect of it has very little to do with anything that human beings are doing, except that they are reacting to what is occurring. The furnace, we might say, is being heated 7 times hotter than it was wont to be heated. And in this intensification, the self-active mind cannot continue to exist. Its reaction tends to produce a state of insanity. And we see this everywhere. People imagining that they are sane, but behaving insanely. And this is characteristic of insanity, isn't it? The person doesn't know it. So we have a deplorable condition. But it is a process of cleaning up, too. There is an emergence out of the vibrational cloud and into the light again, so to speak, so that the restoration must take place. Simply because the fallen state can no longer exist. Now we are rapidly moving to this point. There is an intensification. We are emerging. Come out of her, my people. Well, we can't help but come out, actually, as long as we're sitting on the earth. Because the earth is coming out. But if we do not associate ourselves with the new state, we experience destruction. In the parable that I read this morning, the question was asked as to what the Lord of the vineyard would do, and it was said that he would destroy those evil husbandmen. Well, of course, that's not the true picture at all. The Lord's not going to destroy anyone. But it seems as though it's that way to the evil husbandman. Because they can't stand the intensification that is occurring. It's driving them crazy. And the attitude then is that some terrible scourge is being let loose on earth. Somehow, someone must be to blame over there. God, perhaps, or the devil, or somebody. But of course, the evil husbandmen are to blame for their own destruction. It is fundamentally self-destruction. Here is a portrayal of something that is occurring in relationship to the influences of the universe around us brought to bear with respect to the earth. Now, if we begin to have an increased sense of relatedness to the universe around us, we may recognize that what is being brought to bear is not destructive. It is creative. It is part of the creative process operating in the cosmos as a whole. It only seems destructive to those who are self-conscious in the realm which is being dissipated. We don't need to stay at that level. We have noted that in this fallen state, we have been living in a three-dimensional world. Actually, for most, it's less than 3 dimensions. A three-dimensional world. When the fact of the matter is that it is a 7-dimensional world. Unless we are capable of surviving in a 7-dimensional world, we can't survive. We have, up to this point, been capable of surviving a few years in a 3-dimensional world. Generation after generation, this has been so, in the fallen state, while this vibrational cloud was in effect. This was possible. But the vibrational cloud is moving away from us, or we are moving out of it, so that it's no longer possible to continue to exist merely in a 3-dimensional world. We must come out into a 7-dimensional world. And we're in the process of coming out with a bang. There is an exponential curve in this regard. This impetus, which is being experienced by everyone, a very intense compulsion, increasing, is a destructive thing. To those who are attempting to continue to exist in a 3-dimensional world. Now, we see this attempt being made valiantly all around us. The endeavor is to keep things going in the world as it has been known. We must have the government operating. We must have the various departments of government operating. We must have all the various levels of government all around us operating in order to maintain the world in which we live, or have lived, which is a 3-dimensional world. Ross, I believe, is going to attend the meeting shortly, and he's going to be the chairman. He's going to be on the spot, in which a discussion will be forthcoming from the various bodies of government, local government, as to how to split up the tax dollars equitably in order to keep things going. So there is still the general endeavor to maintain the 3-dimensional world as it has been known. It's becoming more and more difficult. There are not enough dollars to go around, you see. That's one of the things, anyway. There are a lot of other things, too. That's only one small piece of the pie. Most people have very narrow ranges of vision in this regard. There are those who are very much centered in finances and the stock market and what have you, and all the things that are happening. And this is all they see. And they're looking for an upturn, you see, in a little while. Because it always happened in the past. and the way we judge the future is out of the past. Well, that was possible for a while we lived in the cloud and were able to exist in this three-dimensional state. But there are no precedents, within the memory of man at least, with respect to a seven-dimensional state. So he's entirely at sea. However, there is this more or less desperate endeavor to maintain the three-dimensional world with which man is familiar. Actually, in the long run, an impossible task. Because we are moving out of an old state into a new one, whether we like it or not. We're being born out of it on a space vehicle. And so the new is coming. A state in which the self-activity of the human mind is impossible. Therefore, if one insists upon maintaining a self-active mind, there is a crunch coming. There is a stone wall beyond which the self-active mind cannot pass. So it behooves us, surely, to permit the self-activity of the mind to pass away so that we have a different state of consciousness which is capable of continuing to exist in the new vibrational condition. All this could be talked about, looked at, and perhaps comprehended to some degree, but it is something that requires actual experience. And we're being pushed into it, one way or another. There is this intensification, there is this hotting up, there is this increasing impetus, which is driving some crazy, and allowing for an expansion of consciousness and understanding on the part of others, depending on which side of the fence, so to speak, the person is. And the side of the fence is not determined by belief of some kind. It's determined by what the actual state of the individual is. So there's no escape. We can't pretend and get by with it. The requirement is absolute honesty, because there's no means of remaining dishonest and experiencing the new state. So here we go. Traveling, I don't know what the speed is, the solar system through the galaxy, but quite fast. And the changes come. Now, this passage which I read, in the 31st verse, asks the question, "Canst thou bind the sweet influences of Pleiades or loose the bands of Orion?" Well, obviously not. These are constellations which have an influence upon us, upon more than us, but we're included. In a sense, I suppose you could say here is Papa and Mama of the solar system. And the characteristics of the parents are reproduced in the child. So the nature of these constellations is very much to point in relationship to our experience, because we are included in what might be called the child. Canst thou bind the sweet influences of Pleiades? Pleiades have been called the seven sisters. And there is a relatedness here to what we have considered before, the seven spirits before the throne of God. Here is the nature of God as it relates to us, and is, consequently, our nature if we were made in the image and likeness of God. Canst thou bind the sweet influences of the Pleiades? They are sweet influences, desirable influences. We have given specific names to the seven spirits before the throne of God, recognizing that each of them relates to love. The seventh spirit is love, and the sixth beyond it or below it are differentiations of love based in the design of truth. Now here we have the truth for man. This is his true nature. Each individual is rightly characterized by these spirits before the throne of God. This is the divine character for each one. Can you bind it? Well, this is what people have been attempting to do, isn't it? Attempting to bring the Spirit of God under man's control, attempting to use the truth for human purposes. An attempt to bind the sweet influences of Pleiades. This is a state of self-activity. To try to bind the truth, to make it work for man. And in order to bind the truth to make it work for man, the bands of Orion have to be loosed. We have somehow to get out from under the control of Orion, or what is symbolized by Orion. Out from under the divine control. And this exactly describes the fall and man's experience since the fall. He has been endeavoring to bind the sweet influences of Pleiades, in other words, to pervert the truth to his own ends, and this has produced distortions of the true spirits before the throne of God. So that the inhabitants of the earth have been filled with these distorted evil spirits. Consequent upon the endeavor to bind the sweet influences of Pleiades, to make everything serve man. And in this endeavor, he had to, in his imagination at least, throw off the control of God. Now, this is all the operation of the human intellect, isn't it? The guiding light of fallen man, guiding him into the pit. Now, it is, in fact, impossible for man to bind the sweet influences of Pleiades. They're not going to change at all. They're still here, they're still operative. Nor to loose the bands of Orion. God rules yet. The divine control is still a reality. Nothing that man has done has changed anything in that regard. It has merely changed man's own experience. And he has been living in a dream state, completely unaware of the true state, where the bands of Orion hold all things in the divine design. And the sweet influences of the Pleiades are operative constantly. Because all these things are so, the cosmos is still going ahead, and the solar system is still moving in the galaxy, and the Earth is going along with the solar system, moving from one set of influences into another set of influences, regardless of anything that human beings can do. Orion, the Pleiades are still in place. Nothing's really changed except the experience of man on Earth. Consequent upon his blindness and forgetfulness and the distortion of the divine spirits which have produced hate and greed and all these things, fear, shame. No, we can't bind the sweet influences of Pleiades really. Only within the range of our own experience. Neither can we loose ourselves from the bands of Orion, except in imagination. Now, as our space vehicle moves into this new vibrational experience, we begin to become aware of these things. We begin to become aware that it's futile to try to bind the sweet influences of Pleiades. We'd better quit. And we can't, by any means whatsoever, get ourselves loose from the bands of Orion, except by dying. But then, when that happens, merely something that was unreal in the first place dissipates. Whatever was real about us, the physical substance of our bodies, for instance, remains. Just the unreal state, just the unreal pattern, just the unreal identity is dissipated. The bands of Orion remain, and the sweet influences of the Pleiades remain. We begin to see how utterly futile, how utterly foolish It is to enter into this struggle to bind the sweet influences of Pleiades. Now, it could be done for a little while on the part of mankind as a whole, and on the part of individuals just for 70 years and 10. But no more. No more. Because we're emerging out of that three-dimensional condition into a seven-dimensional condition. And the intensification of things, the building up of the pressure, the igniting of the explosive, is what actually propels the movement into the new state. The bullet goes. The charge which set it off stays behind. I seem to recall somewhere in Lighting the Way in You, wasn't it? Gironda said that every kick becomes a boost. And that is the way it is if there is association with the divine state, an acceptance of the sweet influences of Pleiades, the seven spirits before the throne of God in one's own expression. Then one finds that Orion is right there in control. The control is here on Earth through those whose experience is that of the seven spirits before the throne of God. These questions here have meaning. They really do. And if we have understanding, we can begin to answer that. And we would say, no, we can't bind the sweet influences of Pleiades nor loose the bands of Orion. But we're quite willing to accept things the way they are. We're quite willing to experience the truth of all this. So we may rejoice in that expansion of awareness, of sensing, which brings us to know that we are a part of this vast whole. Individually, we are a part of this vast whole. And we are a part of each other. Members of one body, the body of the Son of God on earth. We may share the increasing consciousness of these things as there is yielding. We're no longer trying to maintain ourselves in a three-dimensional world which is passing away. But we are interested in discovering the seven-dimensional world into which we are moving. In awareness. In our awareness. We're in it already, in actual fact. Everybody has been in it all this time but never known it. Now we've got to know it or perish. So the door opens for our knowing. And from your own experience, you are aware of a change of consciousness The change that has taken place in your consciousness is unique to each one, but it is part of the process of the experience of movement into what we have called the seven-dimensional world, the new state. For it is in this that existence is alone possible. No more in the three-dimensional state. It was only a temporary thing anyway. That's why man was warned about it. It was only a temporary thing, a temporary obscuring of vision, out of which there would be emergence in due course. There need have been none of this misery that has occurred in the world. If the mind hadn't forgotten that it couldn't see. How wonderful to be restored to vision and to life. Life is one of the seven spirits before the throne of God, remember? The fifth. Well, we certainly have to come out of the three-dimensional world to find it. And this is what is occurring. Fantastic? Maybe to the human mind. Unfortunately, the fantasies of the human mind don't control Orion. And so it goes, and so we go, one way or another, up or down. And so is it true of everybody else, without exception. How blessed we are to share something of this vision, to begin to know the truth, that we may be made free to live in the seven-dimensional world. O Lord, we are deeply thankful that, yielding to thy Spirit, the door to understanding opens, and the old fantasies begin to be seen for what they really are, or were: unreal. So that the unreal is seen as being unreal, and the real begins to be seen as being real. And there is a reversal of consciousness, which permits new vision, restored vision. We are most thankful, O Lord, for the privilege and opportunity of playing our parts in what is unfolding in these grand and awful days in the Christ. Amen. I'm very thankful that I'm able to speak of these things to you. Without engendering disbelief. The mind doesn't understand very much. but it may become a useful instrument in the hands of the Lord to the extent that it yields. And this is wisdom. The wisdom of men is foolishness with God, and vice versa. That you begin to have sufficient experience, sufficient awareness to understand. One wouldn't have to go back very many years to find a point where it'd be quite impossible to talk about things of this nature. Things are changing. How very sluggish we have been. And how much more there is that would be deemed now to be fantastic, to the extent that our minds are still self-active. To be known, to be experienced. As our Master said, I have yet many things to say unto you, but ye cannot bear them now. Step by step, to the extent of our actual experience, we can bear these things. Not because we get better educated in the orthodox fashion, but because we become more experienced in the ways of the Lord. And then we have ears to hear and hearts to understand. It's been good to share this day with you.